What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Haze Demon Show. And today we are going to read some more Resident Evil Zero Hour, wrote by S.D. Perry. It has been really awesome to read this book for you guys. I hope you are enjoying it. And if you are, make sure to hit that like button. We are going to continue to do all of these books for Resident Evil. After this one, we'll be going to basically Resident Evil 1, which has a different name, The Umbrella Conspiracy. So we are going to be reading chapter 12 all the way to the end of the book. So I'm not going to tell you exactly how many chapters, but it is roughly about a little bit longer than the last amount that we've read on pages, but I think it shouldn't take as long. Anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this bad boy. Chapter 12. He watched the young twosome crawl down from the hole, make their way back to the combination door. Finally, they'd found a way to get it open. He'd expected them to break the lock, but one of them had apparently found the leech growth records, had worked out the code. It seemed a single hunter, a lone knight, was no match for them. The young man was surprised, but not overly so. Watching as they opened the locked door, they possessed some small animal cleverness. These two. How sad for the world that they had to be destroyed. The young man smiled. Humanity would surely recover from the loss in ample time to effect Umbrella's crucifixion. Besides, the children were already in place. Billy pushed the door to the cable car hangar open, the two of them smiling, congratulating one another as they discovered their means of escaping the lab. The cable car was operational, although they wouldn't be operating it. Their lives were mere seconds from ending. The children watched from the shadows beneath the car, from the half-drained sewers, gathering into humanoid form, one, two of them. With a thought, a sigh, the young man released them from harness, sent the two bishops lurching towards their prey. A sound, a scream. He frowned, turned one of the false men to see what he had cried out from the darkness behind them, and it was attacked by an eliminator. The primate jumping on the humanoid collective from out of nowhere, howling as it ripped into the midst of the children with dripping jaws. From the platform, Rebecca and Billy were alerted by the sound of the fight, were ready with their weapons, furious, torn. The young man hesitating, wanting to finish them, to kill them, but concerned for the children. He sent them forward, ignoring the primate's attack, letting the many stream away from its vicious jaws, reform again at the edge of the platform next to the second collective. The two false men clambered over the rail, eager to taste of the interlopers. The eliminator followed, leaping after them. He watched in horror as Billy got off a single blast at one of the false men with his shotgun, managing a clear shot. The young man felt the many screaming, felt the hive diminish, and his fury intensified, was fraught with anguish now, too, as Billy fired again, Rebecca joining in with her handgun. In bare seconds, one of the collectives were effectively destroyed. No! No! The many had never faced a shotgun. He'd had no idea they could be so readily injured by it, but he couldn't retreat now, not in mid-attack. His racing thoughts told the survivors to rally, to join with the second false man as the eliminator leaped for Billy, snatched at him with thick claws. The primate grappled with the killer, and then the two of them went over the rail, disappearing into the sewers with a mighty splash. Rebecca screamed, rushing to the railing, but the second collective was almost upon her now. The young man felt a hot satisfaction watching as the false man extended one magnificent arm, slapped at Rebecca's stupid, screaming face, hard enough to knock her down. She rolled away as he paused, deciding how best to finish her. The loss to the hive was tremendous, unprecedented. He wanted to be sure she paid for it in full. Except she was rolling to her feet now, holding Billy's dropped shotgun, her face contorted with rage. She fired at the collective, blew one of its arms away, the children shrieking in pain as she fired again and again. The young man could barely see her now, the gazes upon her too few, many of the watchers dying even as he struggled to maintain contact. His last vision of her was a watery outline, a shadow growing darker, finally disappearing altogether. Around him, the many wept their salt tears blending into their joined tracks, the sorrowful smell of ocean rising up from their despairing mass. The young man closed his eyes, wept with them, but not for long. His anger was too great. She had to die, as her murdering boyfriend had surely died. He didn't dare risk more of the children. The tyrant, his king. He managed a smile. His anger was great. His wrath would be greater still. Scene change. There was a magnum on the cable car, locked in the cold, rubbery fingers of a dead man. As the small aerial car made its short journey from one platform to another, gliding silently through the unknown dark, Rebecca pried the revolver free. It was unloaded. She remembered that Billy was carrying a couple of speed loaders with .50 caliber magnum shells, but Is he alive? I'm going to find him, she told herself firmly, stepping from the cable car once it swung to a stop, ignoring the terrified voice in the back of her mind, the part that kept insisting he was surely dead. Billy was gone, lost to the fast-moving sewer beneath the cable car platforms, which had swept him and that monster in this direction. But he was alive, and she was going to find him. The thought cycled, repeated itself. She owed him that hope, that belief, several times over. The second cable car platform was much like the first, small and cold and dark, but there was a set of stairs leading up and out of the hangar. Rebecca took a minute to residuate her weapons, to reload the 9mm. Billy had the remaining shotgun shells on him, but he'd reloaded after that monster had attacked her outside the kennel room. After he saved your life again. And there were still 2 rounds left. She wouldn't leave it behind, nor did she think it was wise to leave the magnum. She never knew when she might find another cache of ammo. The heavy revolver dragged on her belt, the shotgun hard on her injured shoulder. But she wanted to be ready for anything. He's dead, Rebecca. You have to save... No. Save yourself now. Have to. No. She hurried up the stairs, ignoring her body's fatigue. Have to find him. Have to. At the top of the flight, the door opening into a massive, mostly empty warehouse room. The far end open to the night. Rebecca walked across the bare room, stepping over the floor transport track, moved past rusting barrels that lined the walls, her mind too full of Billy for her to think straight. If he was hurt, if he was dead, he might be dead. She started to reject the thought out of hand, but this mental voice wasn't terrified, wasn't in a blind panic. It was calm, reasonable. She took a few deep breaths, stood a moment on the industrial platform elevator that bordered the big room, studied the cool, deep blue sky of early morning. The clouds were finally breaking up, a handful of pale, distant stars shining it down. The storm had passed. She hoped it was an omen of good things to come, but she could only hope. If Billy was dead, and he probably was, she would have to deal with it. But I'm not doing anything until I know. There was a control console on the platform elevator's north side. Rebecca studied the controls a moment, finally deciding she had to descend to the lowest level listed, B4. Try to find an entrance to the sewers. She pushed the control button. The huge octagonal platform jerked, then started down, the walls of the massive well that surrounded the platform sliding up and past, the night sky dwindling overhead. The elevator finally settled into an expansive room, utilitarian, all gray walls and steel. To her right was a small office marked security, and a short hall that ended at another, more conventional elevator, like from an office building. To her left, a cave-in, mounds of rubble heaped up into a low, broken ceiling, and there appeared to be a second elevator there. In front of the stacked debris, this one bigger, a warehouse lift. She stepped from the platform, checking for signs of life in the poorly lit room. Her steps curiously quiet on the chipped concrete. It was empty. She moved to the security office and found it locked, but a glance through the grimy window set into the door told her there was nothing there worth scavenging. She sighed, unsure which way to go. Her plan was to keep descending, her hope that eventually she'd make it to water, but either elevator might lead her in the wrong direction. So pick one. It's better to be wrong than to waste time trying to decide. Right. She mentally flipped a coin, then headed for the elevator west of the platform. She reached for the control panel, for the single button there, and a soft ping sounded as the elevator came to a stop on her floor. She scrambled back. There was no time, no place to run. She flattened herself in the corner, as close to the doors as she could get, praying that whoever it was would be in too much of a hurry to look behind them. The doors slid open. She held the shotgun ready, held her breath as a lone figure stepped out, a big man wearing a vest. Rebecca lowered the shotgun, eyes wide, as Enrico Marini spun around, aiming his 9mm at her. "Don't shoot!" She saw surprise, the shock of recognition register on his face, and then he pulled up, aiming at the ceiling. "Rebecca," he said, relaxing slightly, and she noticed the dirt on his hands and face, the smears of blood on his arms. The knuckles of both hands looked battered and bruised. His STARS vest was ripped in several pieces. Obviously, she hadn't been the only Bravo team member struggling to survive. "Are you okay?" "You're alive," she said, stepping forward, so happy to see him that she didn't know how she wasn't crying with relief. He clumsily embraced her with one arm, patting her shoulder before stepping away. "The others?" she asked. Enrico turned, looked toward the industrial lift. "They came ahead. We were looking for Edward, and you." She lowered her eyes. "Edward. He didn't make it." Enrico's gaze hardened slightly, but he only nodded. "Did you see the rest of the team come through?" "No." "They must have just missed you," he said. "We found these documents." He shook his head, as if denying a story that would take too long to tell. She understood completely. "Due east of here is an old mansion," he continued. "We believe that Umbrella uses it for research. Come on, we can catch up to them if we hurry." He started to walk away, and she felt her heart knot, a hot, hard fist in her chest. "Wait," she blurted, before she could think twice. "I've got to find Billy." Enrico turned, stared. "Billy Cohen? You found him?" "Yes, but we got separated, and..." She trailed off, not sure how to explain. "No point worrying about him," Enrico said. "He won't make it, anyway. Let's go." "Sarai," she swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "It's a long story, but I need to find him. Don't worry, I'll catch up with you." "Rebecca," he started, then seemed to read something in her voice. Perhaps the same story she'd read in his. Too much had happened, and any explanation would probably take longer than either of them could afford. "Be careful," he said, and she drew herself up, gave him a firm nod, the acknowledgement of one professional to another. He turned and started away. She watched him go, watched as he reached the pile of rubble on the other side of the vast room, turned to the elevator, there, disappeared from her sight. "I finally found my team, and tell them to go ahead without me," she thought, too wary to be astounded by her decision. They were alive, at least. As soon as she found Billy, they would head east, catch up to the team at the Umbrella Mansion. She checked the elevator that Enrico had appeared from, found that it only went up. That made her decision easier, anyway. She walked across the room to the other one. She pushed the recall button, heard the creak and jerk of movement, the mechanism humming from somewhere inside the shaft. It was slow, crawling back from wherever Enrico had taken it. Rebecca leaned against the door, wishing it would hurry. She was too tired to stop moving, afraid that she might not get started again. A large chunk of rock rolled down the shadows at the top of the debris pile. hit the cement floor not far from where she stood, broke into several pieces. It was quickly followed by another, then a third, and then a small avalanche, many of the slabs shifting, resettling as a small cloud of dust rose up from the fallen debris. Rebecca stepped back from the elevator door, eyeing the pile nervously. Crunch, crunch, crunch. What sounded like heavy footsteps coming from the mound of wreckage. More rock shifted, clattered to the floor. Enrico? She asked, her voice hopeful and very small in the dust-choked air. Crunch, crunch. She pushed the recall button again. From the sound, the elevator continued to inch closer, but now she could see something moving. Something in the shadows. Something big. And it was coming for her. Scene change. Billy held on to the broken remains of an eroded support pillar, waves and eddies of cold, dark water rushing past him, working to loosen his numb fingers. He held tight, half-conscious, tried to assess, tried to resolve. He could barely think at all. He remembered the monkey. Baboon, she said. Attacking, its dirty claws sinking into his upper arms. Remembered hitting the railing hard. Remembered the splash of grimy water, the oily, sour taste and smell of it as it washed over him. Rebecca shouting his name, her voice fading as the current carried him away. There was the gurgling scream of the panicked animal as it let go, was drawn under, and then there was an outcropping of rock, and a sharp pain at one temple, and now he was here, somewhere. He was hurt, dizzy, lost. To his right, the waters gathered and roared, pushing their way through a giant pipe that led into darkness, a pipe more than big enough to swallow him whole. There was some kind of walkway, perhaps 10 meters to his left, suspended over the swirling water, but it might as well have been 10 clicks, for his chances of getting to it. The water was too fast, too wild, and he wasn't the best swimmer, even on a good day. He held on. It was all he knew how to do. Chapter 13. The creature that pulled itself up and out of the rubble was like nothing Rebecca had ever seen before. It stood up near the top of the debris pile, raised its arms as though stretching, allowing her a clean look at it, making her mouth go dry, her palms sweat. She had a sudden, desperate urge to go to the bathroom. It was humanoid, human, almost, in that it had the facial features of a man, except no man glowed so pale, its hairless skin, its body, a luminous, near white. No man had claws that extended almost the length of his arms, the talons curved and shining like steel knives, longer on the right hand than on the left. The thick ropes of its veins were visible through its skin. Masses of red and white tissue humped over its huge shoulders, across its massive chest. Clusters of blood-red sores were liberally scattered over its 3-meter-tall body, and much of its lower face had been ripped away, revealing a bleeding, flesh-and-bone grin, which it turned to Rebecca now, snicking its talons as though greatly anticipating their meeting. The creature looked down at her, its impossible grin seeming to widen slightly. She could hear it breathing, a harsh rasping sound, could actually see the pump of its strange, pulsing heart, only partly shielded by its ribcage. Barely aware that she'd raised the shotgun, Rebecca fired. The blast peppered its chest with black, sudden ribbons of blood sliding down its body. It threw back its huge, bald head and screamed, a sound like Armageddon, like the end of everything. There was more rage, more fury than pain, and Rebecca suddenly understood that she wasn't going to survive very much longer. With a single graceful leap, the monster sprang from the pile of shattered rock, hit the floor not 4 meters away in a crouch. Rebecca could feel the ground tremble, its steel talons raked against the concrete as it drew itself up, its gray, malignant gaze fixing on her. She backed away, pumping the shotgun, her entire body shaking as she tried to aim, tried to target its horrible grin. It stepped closer, came between her and the elevator, just as she heard the elevator car slide to a stop, heard the door unlatch. The creature took another step. At least it's slow. If I can lure it away, then run back. Another step, and she could hear and see a crack appear in the pavement beneath its thick black toenails. She moved back, tried to lengthen the distance between them, and suddenly it was running, fast, a blur as it dropped one arm, sweeping it up, the blades of its hands close enough for her to see a reflection of her own movement as she dove out of the way. She did a shoulder roll, clutching the shotgun to her chest, coming to her feet even as the creature finished its strange, sweeping run. Sparks flew up from the wall next to the elevator. A control panel ripped apart, and behind her, lights flashed, an alarm sounded, and a massive metal door between her and the platform elevator she'd come down on began to close, sliding down. It would cut the room in half and trap her with the freakish monster. She ran, determined to be on the other side of that door. It was heavy and dropping fast, a thick slab of metal, surely impenetrable to the creature. She cleared it easily, turned to watch, running backward. The man-made monstrosity started after her, ducking beneath the lowering panel. She felt her heart hammering, a sheen of sweat breaking out across her body. If she ended up on the same side as that thing, it was all over. She waited, the creature moving toward her slowly, surely, and as the bottom of the door reached the level of her head, she ran back to the other side, having to duck herself, praying that the thing would end up trapped. It started to follow again, crouching, raising its claws over its head as it moved under the door. She felt a flash of hope that the door would crush it, and then she heard metal screech as its giant talons dug grooves into the lowering panel. She watched in horror, in amazement, as it actually slowed the door's descent just enough for it to get underneath. Then it was through, and the door settled to the floor with a resounding clang. Her every instinct was telling her to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. With that door coming down, the room was barely bigger than her studio apartment. She had to get inside that elevator. It was her only chance. She broke for it. She grabbed the handle to the door, started to slide it open, and heard the monster coming. Heard the pound of its heavy feet, the crack of cement as it thundered toward her. Shit! She didn't even turn, instinctively knowing that there wasn't time. She dropped instead, fell to her knees, and scrambled to one side, just as the claws came crashing down, hacking into the elevator door, piercing the wall where she'd been standing only a second before. She stumbled backwards as the monster turned, fixed its gaze on her again, took a step. It was as focused, as relentless as some kind of machine. It drew one overlong arm back, like it was going to toss a ball, perhaps, and took a second rumbling step. Think! She couldn't fight it. Probably couldn't kill it with what she had left. Her only hope was to trick it somehow. The plan was still forming even as she put it into action. The creature was too big. It couldn't easily stop once it started to run. If she got it to moving, ducked out at the last second, she might have time to get to the elevator door open. She stopped moving, as far from the elevator as she could get in the small space. Another step. The talon snicked. It took all of her will not to break and run. She kept the shotgun pointed at the creature, readying herself to dive for the elevator as soon as it picked up speed. The monster's grin widened as its knees bent slightly and as it readied to spring. And then it was moving. Only a few running steps and it would be on her. Rebecca flew, ducked, and ran, slamming into the elevator door. Grabbing at it with trembling, hurried hands, she jerked the door open, blundered inside, turned to close the door, and the thing was already fixed on her again. Already moving fast, much too fast. The door wouldn't hold. She knew it. She brought the shotgun up. No time to aim. Fired. The blast caught its right shoulder. It staggered back, screaming, blood flying from its shredded wound, and then Rebecca saw nothing more. She slammed the door closed and hit the lowest button on the board, squeezing her eyes shut, and started to pray. Seconds passed. The elevator continued down, and finally came to a stop. She stopped praying, long enough to hear the rushing water outside. Must be the sewer. But she was too freaked to care much for the moment, her body still trembling wildly. After what seemed a long time, the shaking subsided. She was okay, or alive, at least, and that was something. With a final prayer that she might never see that thing again, Rebecca pushed the door open and stepped out. Scene change. William Birkin was finally leaving when he heard the inhuman scream echo through the otherwise silent facility, a scream of pure rage. He stopped at the entrance to the small underground tunnel that led to the outside. Looking back toward the executive control room, he'd spent the last 2 hours in the tiny, hidden area, first struggling to make the decision, then struggling to make the computer obey his override commands. The destruct sequence was set for just over an hour, as Wesker had suggested. The obliteration of the facility and its surrounding complex would coincide with the beginning of a new day. That scream. He'd never heard anything like it, but knew immediately what it was, having seen the project in its final stages. Nothing else could make such a sound. The Tyrant prototype was loose. The shadows that bordered the narrow tunnel suddenly seemed too deep, too lonely, too capable of secrecy. Birkin turned and hurried away, sure now that he'd made the right decision. It was all going to burn. Scene change. Billy heard something. He lifted his heavy head, managed to turn slightly. There, to his left, a door opened onto the walkway, and out stepped a human figure. "Hey," he called, but he couldn't manage any volume, the sound of his voice lost to the rushing water. He closed his eyes. "Billy!" He looked again, felt warmth welling up deep inside. Rebecca, it was Rebecca, leaning over the railing, calling his name, and the sight and sound of her brought him around some, pushed the bone-weary exhaustion away, just a little. "Rebecca?" he said, raising his voice, not sure if she could hear. He tried to think of something to tell her, some action should take, but could only say her name again. The situation was self-explanatory, and he was in a bad way. If she wanted to help him, she'd have to come up with something on her own. "Billy, look out!" Rebecca gesturing wildly with one hand, fumbling for her handgun with the other. The terror in her voice woke him up. He clutched the support pillar tighter, trying to pull himself up to see what she was pointing at, and caught just a glimpse of something moving fast, something long and dark, slipping through the water like a giant serpent rushing at him. He tried to move, to edge around the pillar, but the water was too fast. He couldn't let go. He'd be lost in less than a second. Rebecca fired once, twice, and the unseen creature slammed into the support pillar hard enough to shake him free. He yelled, paddling furiously to stay above the frothing water, to resist the pull of the emptying pipe, but it was no good. In seconds, he was swept into the dark, pushed and pummeled, the sound of the water filling his ears as it carried him away. Chapter 14. In the midst of Rebecca's brief battle with the proto-tyrant, William Birkin sneaked out of the facility, his head low, his proverbial tail tucked between his legs. The young man had lost track of him a few hours earlier, had assumed that the scientist had followed Wesker up and out. Those people from Rebecca's little adventure team had, only moments before, but there he was, half running through one of the hidden exit tunnels, his pallid, twitching face a mask of fear, terrified by the sounds of the battle, certainly, entirely unaware that he was alive only because his life was so very unimportant. Although he'd wish to deal with him personally, the young man let the scientist go now, pray for another day. He was too enraptured by the fight, too eager to see Rebecca torn limb from limb. Instead, he saw her duck her fate yet again, a combination of deafness and stupid luck that was quite a marvel to behold. He watched as she left the tyrant behind and came across Billy only a moment later, somehow still alive, clinging like a barnacle to a rock as a sea of sewer water churned around him. A single blow by one of the water creatures sent him spiraling away to one of the plant's many filter rooms. left Rebecca screaming after him, surely half mad with frustration, with loss, and crushed hope. The young man smiled, a cold and nasty smile, calmer than he'd felt for some time as he watched Rebecca cross the walkway, find another elevator in the plant's operations room, wend her way toward the depths of the plant, where he and his hive waited, curling together in their cocoon of glittering liquid excretions. With luck, she'd come across Billy soon, possibly even alive. Probably, in fact. He understood now that he'd simply tried too hard to rush matters to hurry her fate. A confrontation was inevitable. And hadn't he truly wanted an audience all along? Someone to appreciate his magnificent undertaking? Besides, the dawn would be soon. A dangerous time for the children, their delicate bodies easily burned by even the weakest sunlight. Better that he let the two interlopers come to him. They would know of his glory before he crushed them himself. He watched and waited, excited for the final chapter of his triumph to begin. Scene change. Rebecca wasn't sure where she was. The descending levels and rooms of the new building impossibly tangled, but she kept going, kept moving down. The hallways were clear, but two of the rooms she moved through, yet another small control room of unknown purpose, and a wrecked employee lounge, were infested with zombies. She only had to shoot 2 of the 7 that she saw. The rest were too decrepit, too slow-moving, to constitute a real threat. She wished she had the time and the ammo to put all of them down, to spare them what their lives had become, but seeing Billy again kept her hurrying. He was hurt, but alive, and hidden somewhere in the depths of the confusing layout. The new facility was a water treatment plant. She could tell that from the pervasive odor, if not from the signs and control boards that seemed to litter every other room. But she thought it was also a front for more of Umbrella's illegal activities. Why else would it be connected to the training facility, albeit indirectly? She went through a small courtyard area on the 7th basement level. At least, she thought, it was the 7th. That had to be under construction before the virus had hit, and she doubted very much that the rock-carved bunker, replete with a forklift, had much to do with water treatment. Yeah, but what the hell do I know? She thought, randomly, pushing herself to move faster. Through another door, a room with a sunken pit full of crates, to one side. Until tonight, she hadn't believed in zombies, or bioweapons, conspiracies. Truth be told, she hadn't really believed that such deliberate evil could exist. What she'd seen, what she'd experienced, since stepping onto the train all those hours ago, everything was different now. She didn't know that she'd ever again be able to turn such a naive eye to the world around her, that she'd ever be able to look at a person or place without wondering what hidden face lay behind what she saw. She wasn't sure if she would be angry or grateful for the loss of innocence. If she stayed within the stars, it would undoubtedly serve her well. At the back of the room with the crates, a metal staircase. Rebecca stopped at the top, caught her breath as she looked down, grimacing with distaste, unsure of how to proceed. There were leeches on the stairs, at least a few dozen scattered across the steps, hanging from threads of slime, or tracking glistening paths across the gray metal. She didn't want to get near them, afraid that they might attack if she got too close, or hurt one of them. But she didn't want to backtrack either. She felt like time was speeding up, like things were happening fast and faster, that she had to keep up or risk being lost, or risk running into that thing again. The clawed-killing machine, its angry scream still echoed in her mind. She'd wounded it, but the chances that it had crawled away in some dark corner to die were slim to none. Things like that were never so accommodating. Gritting her teeth, she carefully stepped over and around the leeches, pausing after each step, swallowing bile as one slid over the toe of her boot before continuing on its way. It was a short flight, at least. She got down without stepping on any of the horrid little things, reaching the door at the bottom without further incident. When she opened the door, a cold mist sprayed across her sweating skin, the roar of emptying pipes like music. It was a big room, dominated by huge, jutting conduits to one side, water from them splashing down and over a series of mesh filters. And there, amid a scatter of random flotsam, Billy! Rebecca ran to Billy's prone form, a bitter waterfall splashing down beside them as she crouched, reached for his throat. She pushed his dog tags aside, shaking inside, but there was a strong, even pulse at her touch. He opened his eyes, looked blearily up at her. Rebecca? He coughed, starting to sit up, and she gently placed one hand on his chest, pushing him down. He had a purpling knot on his left temple, a big one. Just rest a minute, she said, having to force the words around the hardness in her throat. She'd wanted to believe he'd be all right, but it had been so hard. Let me check you out. A faint smile played across his lips. "'Kay, but then it's my turn," he mumbled and coughed again. He answered her questions without any confusion as she pushed and prodded, checked his range of motion, cleaned a few of his deeper scratches. The knot on his head seemed to be the worst of his injuries, causing him some dizziness and nausea, but it wasn't nearly as bad as she'd feared, and after only a few minutes of her ministrations, he pushed himself into a sit, turning a weak smile her way. Okay, he said, wincing as she touched his temple. "I'll survive, but not if you keep poking me." "Right," she said, sitting back on her heels, feeling a surprisingly deep satisfaction. She'd set out to find him, and had. She'd had no idea that such a basic sense of accomplishment could be so fulfilling, could so easily overwhelm all of the negatives in their situation, even if only for a moment. "I'm glad you're alive, Billy." He nodded, wincing again at their movement. "You and me both." She helped him to his feet, supporting him as he found his balance. When he was steady enough, he stepped away, and she saw a look of disgust cross his face, his mouth curving down as he moved past her, toward one corner of the room where a slick of dark water poured over another mesh filter. The corner of the room was heaped with bones, human bones, worn smooth by years of falling water, thick with a greenish bacterial slime. Rebecca counted at least 11 skulls among the tumble of femurs and cracked ribs, most of them crushed or broken. Some of Marcus's old experiments? Billy's tone was low. It wasn't really a question, and Rebecca didn't answer it, only nodding. "It's umbrella," she added after a moment. "They encouraged it. They were all in it together." Now Billy didn't answer, only stared at the bones, some unknown emotion in his dark gaze. After a second, he shook it off, turned away from the sad remnants of human life. "What say we blow this popsicle stand?" he asked, and though his words were light, neither of them smiled. "Yeah," she said, reaching out to grab his hand for a moment, just a moment, squeezing his fingers tightly in her own. He squeezed back. "Yeah, that sounds good." Scene change. Billy felt like shit, but he soldiered on as Rebecca led them vaguely eastward, wanting more than anything to get free of Marcus's damned playground before he allowed himself to collapse. As they wandered through a maze of corridors and rooms, Billy was hopelessly lost after their second turn. She told him what had happened to her since he'd been dragged off the cable car platform. She'd had a run-in with her team leader, and a fight with some super creature Frankenstein, that she very nearly didn't survive. She'd also found a .50 Magnum revolver to match the ammo he'd been lugging around, some serious firepower, and had managed to hang on to the shotgun. In all, he thought she'd done better than he probably would have in the same circumstances. They found an empty bunk room and loaded up, Billy taking the Magnum, Rebecca keeping the shotgun. There was a sealed gallon jug of water under one of the bunks, and they took turns gulping it down, both of them desperate for hydration. It turned out that swimming in sewer water didn't do much for one's thirst. Refreshed by the water, holding decent and fully loaded weapons, Billy finally felt like he might recover from his ride through the rapids. They took the southern exit from the bunk room, through an industrial treatment room, then another. The rooms of the plant blurred together for Billy. All looked the same: rusting metal walls and floors, pipe railings, huge walls of unknown equipment covered with dials and switches. Some of the equipment was working, filling the large rooms with echoing blasts of mechanical sounds, though God only knew what it was controlling. Billy found that he didn't care much, though as they continued on, they could both hear the rush of water getting closer, big water. And when they went through a massive pump room that opened out into the chill of pre-dawn, they found a walkway that spanned an actual dam. They stood for a moment, looking out over the dark length of the reservoir that ran alongside the building they emerged from. The crashing curtain of the water that punctuated it at the far end. It was too loud for them to talk, and they stepped back into the pump room, both of them smiling. They'd found a way out, at least. True. The walkway over the dam led to another building, but just seeing the fading stars, the sinking moon, gave Billy a real boost. Their nightmare run through the umbrella complex would be over soon. He could feel it, the end in sight, as surely as the new day soon would dawn. My team probably went this way. They cleared us a path, Rebecca said, looking hopeful. She had to speak up to be heard over the cascade of water just outside, the surging pumps that took up half of the room. Her voice rang slightly against the metal walk that surrounded a pool of water in the room's center. He said they were going east. We're practically out of here. I thought you said Enrico took the elevator up, Billy said. Oh, right, she said, her expression sagging. She blinked, and he realized how very tired she had to be. Sorry, forgot. Understandable, Billy said, but you're right, we are practically out of here. He touched the magnum on his belt, the loose handcuff on his wrist banging into it, a sudden reminder of his life before the Jeep accident. That life seemed so far away now, like it had happened to a different man, but it was still waiting for him, somewhere outside. Thoughts for later, for if. He managed. I smiled, patted the magnum. This is kind of a universal key. Unlocks doors, clears out unwanted disease carriers, you name it. Rebecca smiled back, started to say something, and stopped, staring into his eyes, both of them frozen at the sound of water splashing across the metal walk. As one, they turned to look, to see a giant rising up from the pool a few meters away. A thing that Billy knew instantly was the monster she'd told him about, from the elevator. It was huge, white, covered with blood and sores. It reached out to pull itself from the pool with insanely long, knife-like claws, the tips screeching against the walkway. Billy grabbed the magnum, backing away, trying to push Rebecca behind him. She easily evaded his grasp, standing her ground with the shotgun. Billy's heroic ideals dropped away when the creature saw them and let out a terrible scream. A deep, mind-ripping sound of hatred, of lust, not just to kill, but to rend and mutilate. Facing it alone wasn't macho. It was suicidally stupid. When it gets moving, it doesn't maneuver well, Rebecca said, quickly, half under her breath. He had to strain to hear her over the rhythmic beat of the powerful pump engines. If we can get it away from the door, get it running, we can get past it when it tries to turn. Billy took careful aim at the thing's rough-hewn face. It took a deep step forward, and they both backed away. How about we kill it instead? Don't, Rebecca said, her voice edged with panic. You'll just make it mad. What you're seeing now is after 2 shotgun blasts, one of them almost point blank. The thing took another step and lowered itself, slightly, tensing its legs as though about to spring. Run! Billy didn't need to hear it twice. They both turned and ran, pivoted left where the walk did. Behind them, 3 massive, ringing steps sounded against the protesting metal, and then the monster's claws ripped down and across the wall at the corner, a tremendous shriek of sound as the thick steel curled up like wood shavings. Billy turned, raising the magnum as the stopped monster slowly turned to face them. Keep going, he shouted to Rebecca, aiming the pulsing red tumor half buried in its chest, what had to be its heart. The monster took a single step, its opaque gray eyes fixing on Billy, its claws raising. Billy fired, the weapon jumping in his hand, roaring, deafening. A hole erupted in the thing's breastbone, not a direct hit to the heart, but close. Blood poured from the hole, ran down its thick white gut. It howled, the sound even louder than the blast from the hand cannon, and infinitely more deadly. But it didn't go down. Jesus, that should have stopped an elephant. Come on, Rebecca shouted, pulling at his arm. He shook her off, took aim again. If it bled, it could die. And short of a grenade launcher, the .50 Magnum was maybe the best weapon for the job. The monster took a staggering step forward, then seemed to find its balance, its dead gaze focusing on Billy. Blood continued to pour from its wound, had drenched its sexless crotch now, the tops of its muscle-bounded thighs. That grin, that horrible grin. It seemed to be laughing, as though it couldn't wait to share some private joke with him. Billy thought the punchline probably included ripping an arm off and beating him to death with it. He fixed on the heart, squeezed the trigger, and another tremendous bang! More blood flying, the monster screaming, "Oh God, please let that be the pain. Please let that be pain." But not falling. Still not falling. It was hard to tell where he'd hit it. There was blood everywhere, but the heart continued to pulse. Move! Billy was shoved aside, Rebecca stepping forward, raising the shotgun as the creature started to crouch, its legs tensing. She aimed low, too low. There was no way she was going to hit its heart. And the shotgun boomed, and finally, the monster went down, its cry one of rabid fury. It clawed at the walk, its talons pulling a tremendously painful, high squeal from the metal. Billy saw that Rebecca had blown out one of its knees, and hesitated only a second, just long enough to wonder why he hadn't thought of that. It wasn't dead, but unless it sprouted wings, it wasn't going to be coming after them any time soon. Then he raised the Magnum again, fixing on its fish-belly white skull, as it floundered and clawed to pull itself closer, undoubtedly to continue its attack. It only managed to slide itself partway into the water, the dark pool churning with pink foam as it struggled to get out. Waste of ammo, he half-asked, glancing at Rebecca for approval. As terrible as the thing was, he wouldn't feel right about letting it bleed to death, to suffer any more. It was another of Umbrella's victims in a way. It hadn't asked to be born. Yeah, she said, nodding, but he could see the pity in her expression. Could see that she felt the same way. Do it. 2 rounds, the second just to be sure, and the massive body slipped soundlessly into the pool of water, disappearing beneath the surface. Chapter 15. They walked over the dam in the rising light, the deep blue of the early hours giving way to a soft, faded gray that hid all but the brightest stars. Rebecca walked quietly alongside Billy, noticed that the clouds were clearing out. It would be another hot summer day, though at the moment she was doing her best not to shiver. The sun wouldn't be up properly for another half hour at least. She was tired more than she could ever remember being. But just knowing that the long, horrible night was finally at its end, that a new day was here, was enough to keep her from flagging. At the end of the dam walk was a short ladder leading to a door that went up. Billy first, and stepped into a turbine room. More rusty metal railings around cement walks, heavy piped equipment lining the walls. There were 2 doors. The north door dead-ended into a storage room. The door to the west was standing open, led through a long, fenced corridor to another door. Keep going? Billy asked, and Rebecca nodded. It was probably another dead end, but she wanted to keep from having to go back the way they'd come for as long as possible. They'd witnessed enough death and destruction already. She didn't want to have to go back for seconds. She paused as Billy started down the walk, noticing a silvered edge to the heavy door. It was reinforced with steel, and there was a keycard reader next to it. Someone had wedged a stick underneath the bottom of the door to keep it open. A wet stick, she thought, reaching down to touch the glistening wood. When she pulled her hand away, slender strings of goo clung to her fingertips, stretching away from the stick. For a half a second, she had a confused idea that for some reason the leeches had propped the door open, then shook it off, reminding herself that there were leeches all over the facility. She wiped her hand on her vest and caught up to Billy. who was almost at the far end of the walk already, reloading the Magnum. The door was unlocked, and Billy pushed it open, another cement and metal entryway leading down another short hall. Billy stepped inside, sighing, Rebecca sighing along with him. Would this place never end? The room smelled like a beach at low tide, though they couldn't see anything from the entry, the room opening up just out of sight. They'd taken 2 steps inside when they heard the click of a lock, the door sealing behind them. Automatic lock? Rebecca asked, frowning. Billy stepped back to the door, rattled the handle. It was closed before. Doesn't make sense that it would lock after we came through. Rebecca heard something then, a low sound that made her heart skip. The sound quickly rose, became a deep, cackling laugh from the room beyond the entryway. Without a word, she and Billy walked away from the door, both of them holding their weapons tightly, stepped around the corner, and froze, staring at the vast sea of life that surrounded them, that seemed to cover every square inch of wall, that dripped and crawled across the ceiling, the floor. Leeches. Thousands of them. Hundreds of thousands. The room was a large one, high and wide, split by a small corridor that ran along the back wall. Incinerators lined a central construct that rose to the ceiling, openings in the metal showing flickers of fire. There was a big metal door on the south wall, set back into a recessed doorway, which appeared to be the only other way out. If they wanted to run through all those leeches, which Rebecca most definitely did not, the cavernous space was bi-level, a catwalk encircling the central construct, and open fire at one side of the upper walk, casting a flickering glow over the black, bubbling sea that washed across the room's every nook and corner. And on the walk, a lone figure, a tall, broad-shouldered young man, laughing, his strong, strange voice carrying in the salt-scented, rotten air. "Welcome," he said, and laughed again. A leech curled on each shoulder, with others trailing down his extended arm. He was surrounded by the creatures. "So glad you could join us. You're the guests of honor. After all, this is your wake." Rebecca only stared, stunned in silence. Billy took a step forward, raising his voice. "You're his son, aren't you? Or his grandson?" Rebecca knew immediately who he was talking about, and found herself nodding. "Of course. That's right," the young man said, smiling widely, a fiendish smile. "In a way, I'm both." He made a shrugging motion with his arms, and changed, the transformation rippling over his body like water, like a movie effect. His long, dark hair shortened, turned white. His youthful features melted into aged ones, lines and creases forming, his eyes changing color, the pupils enlarging. In seconds, he was no longer the young man, though his smile was just as cold, just as brutal. It was Billy's turn to be silent, as Rebecca breathed out the name, unable to believe that it wasn't another trick, another false face. "Dr. Marcus?" The man on the catwalk nodded and began to speak. Scene change. 10 years ago, Spencer had me assassinated, he said, the memories flashing through his hive mind, the children remembering for him. The images were blurred and dark, indistinct in shape and color, but the feelings were as clear as they had been on the day he lost his life. He had been expecting an attack for some time, but it had still come as a surprise. He had been working in his lab, the children playing in the pool at his feet, when the door burst open, and then there was gunfire, loud and final. He remembered the pain as he fell to his knees, clutching at the holes in his chest, his gut, and remembering seeing 2 familiar faces, the men walking into the room, his brilliant disciples, his best students, watching as he gasped his last breath. Albert Wesker and William Birkin, both smiling. He remembered the sense of loss, the incredible anger that clawed to the surface of his dying mind as his body fell, splashing into the pool, the children scattering as everything went to black. And then the memories changed, became the thoughts of the many. He could see his own face and body, half submerged, pale and ugly in death, but loved, so very loved by the hive mind. He had been their god, their creator and teacher, their father. They swam to him, wormed between his sagging lips, wiggling and strained to enter the gaping holes that had been blown through his poor flesh. Marcus found his voice, telling the two stunned watchers what they needed to know, to understand. They left me to rot, took my notes, and closed my lab, leaving it all to the ruin of time. They didn't understand, you see. Time was what was needed. It took years for the T-verse inside my queen to reconstruct, to evolve, and to become the variation that created what I am now. He smiled, relishing their mute awe, enjoying his moment in the sun of their wonder. So you are correct. I am Marcus, but I'm also Marcus's son and grandson, and every other extension, all other offspring, the union between Marcus and his queen, my queen. She lives inside of me. She sings to her children. At the intensity of his joy, his triumph, the children surged toward him, swam up his legs, tickled their way across his most familiar form, that of James Marcus. He reveled in the feeling, laughing aloud as the revulsion that crossed the faces of his two young guests. If only they knew the phenomenal rapture he felt as part of the hive, its leader and follower. Marcus's death had freed him, had made him far greater than his human life ever would have allowed. I scattered the virus, he said. The world will now know what Umbrella has done, what Spencer and his stupid greed have contrived. Umbrella will burn, but Marcus will be hailed as a god for what he created. I am the archetype of a new man, far superior to the lonely pattern of humanity. The world will seek me out, will beg to join the hive, to unite as one mind, one all-powerful being. The man, Billy spoke again, his face curled in loathing, his voice tight with it. You're dreaming. You're a sick, twisted freak, whatever you are, and the world will seek you out, but only to kill you, to put an end to your insane delusions. Such a fool, so self-righteous in his own stupidity. A great anger rose in him, in the children, tainting his joy. He could feel his body quake with it. We'll see who's going to die, he said, his voice trembling with anger. But it was no longer Marcus's voice. He had become the young man again, the children's vision of Marcus as a youth. He frowned, not sure why he had changed, or how. He had not wished it, had not sung or willed the shift in form. The children swept through him, swollen with his anger, ignoring his inner commands, and for the first time since he'd crawled from the pool only a few months ago, since the hive had given him his new life, he had no control over it. The many would not listen, wanted only to smite the intruders, to squash them. The young man felt them rising to his throat, spilling out like bile, choking him. He tried to hold on, to exert his influence, but the anger was too big, too all-encompassing. He was changing, becoming something entirely new, and his struggle for domination was washed aside, lost to this new thing. The Queen! He could feel her consciousness filling him, her creative power surging forth, carried by the children to every part of his metamorphosing form. She wanted to kill, to destroy the two humans who dared to judge her, and she was far stronger than even he had imagined. The thing that had once been Marcus had no choice but to surrender, to become the most powerful player of all, to become the Queen. Marcus started to change once more, Marcus started to change once more, in a way that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised Billy. Leeches began to pour from his mouth, gagging him, dozens of them sliding out in a rush of slime, hitting the floor like fat raindrops. The young man's eyes were wide, his expression one of disbelief as he continued to choke out the slick fall of leeches. As soon as they hit the floor, the creatures rushed back to the young man, swarming up his body, attaching themselves, burrowing into him. Round shapes moved beneath his skin, tunneling changing the shape and texture of his flesh. His clothes melted away as the leeches continued to swarm, giving his body a strangely rubbery appearance. His arms and legs starting to look like great masses of fat worms twined together. His face elongated, stretching, the skin tearing to expose ribbed striations of purplish muscle tissue, throbbing, turning thick and wet with goo. Next to him, Rebecca drew a sharp breath as the Marcus creature lost its human appearance entirely. Its whole body made up of those fat worms now, stuck together by dripping webs of clear slime. It grew in size as well, the leeches near its joining the multitude, adding mass and height. Long, stringy tentacles shot up from its back, whipping around like streamers in a high wind, the color of inflammation, of infection. "The Queen," Rebecca breathed. "She's taking control." Billy pointed the magnum at the growing creature, and the thing flew upward, leaping straight into the air. It hit the ceiling with a huge, wet smack-like sound and clung there a moment, dribbling thick fluid to the floor far below. Except for having 4 limbs, it no longer looked remotely human. Billy fired at the ceiling, but it was already gone, dropping to the floor in front of them, condensing slightly as it hit the ground like some giant rubber toy. She, stretched out again, towering over him and Rebecca, those dark tentacles snapping around toward them, reaching for them. He and Rebecca both stumbled back. Billy felt his boots sliding as he stepped on any number of the leeches that still covered the floor, heard the soft, fat pop of each creature beneath his heels. Rebecca grabbed his arm, almost falling as she too slipped across the blanket of leech bodies. The deaths of her ghastly children had an immediate effect. The Queen pulled her tentacles back and let out a scream, a strange, high, warbling wail like nothing on earth, a sound made all the more horrible by its complete alienness. All of the leeches in the room started toward her at once, moving away from Rebecca and Billy, clearing a path from beneath and behind their killing footsteps. The leech queen continued to grow as the small bodies packed on, joining together with the core creature. Her size almost doubled in less than a minute. Billy shot a look over his shoulder, saw that they were going to dead end back at the door they entered by if they let the monster choose their path, in the most literal sense of the word. At the room's south side was a closed door set into a kind of recessed entryway. There was a sea of leeches separating them from it, but the sea was on the move, flowing toward the growing Marcus Queen monster. She seemed oblivious to their presence as she packed on more of her hive, swelling to gargantuan size in a soft, sloshing whisper of liquid movement. "South door," Billy said, keeping his voice low as they continued to slowly back away. They had to act now, fast, or their chance would be gone. "If it's locked," Rebecca whispered. "Gotta risk it," he said. "I'll cover. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Rebecca broke and ran as Billy opened fire, pouring rounds into the giant bloated body of the Queen. She screamed, her high wail taking on depths of pain, of hate, and shot a handful of tentacles at him, the appendages moving lightning quick. They grabbed him, lifted him into the air. Billy lost the magnum, couldn't get his handgun as he was widely shaken, his head snapping back and forth, his arms pinned by the creature's brute strength. Her tentacles curled around his chest, tightening like a vise, squeezing so hard that he couldn't draw breath. After only a few seconds, he could feel himself blacking out, the shaking world fading to brilliant spots of darting black. He heard the sound of the shotgun, and the monster was screaming again, dropping him, spinning around to face her new attacker. Billy crashed to the floor. He ignored the pain, scrambled for the magnum, as 100 leeches crawled towards him. As Rebecca fired again, and the monster started for her tentacles, lashing all around. Billy got to his feet, saw that Rebecca had her back turned. The second blast hadn't been aimed at the monster at all, but at a standing control console next to the south door. She fired again, kicking at the door at the same time. It flew open, but the Queen was almost upon her, easily twice her height, heavier by far. She'll rip her apart like a paper doll. "Hey!" Billy screamed. No time to reload the magnum. Had to get her attention fast. and he leaped into the nearest wave of leech bodies, jumping up and down, kicking and stomping as hard as he could. They burst by the dozen, spilling Icarus blood and goop across the floor, drenching his boots. He danced on their dying bodies, feeling a fierce, uninhibited satisfaction as the Leech Queen spun again, howling in distress. He saw Rebecca make it through the door, had a half second to be glad about it, and then the monster was snatching him up again, throwing him across the giant room in a blind rage. Billy slammed into the back wall. He felt a rib crack. Then he was falling, landing heavily on the cement floor. It drove the wind out of him, but he was on his feet again in a second, running for the south door, leeches popping underfoot as he struggled to breathe. The monster was about the same distance from the door as he was. Billy saw that he wouldn't make it, that she would get there before him, and sent a silent plea to whoever might be listening, that Rebecca make it out alive. And then he saw her, not behind the south door at all, but half across the room, her shotgun trained on the Leech Queen, her back to the central incinerator. Billy realized that she must have run out again while the monster had been busy, throwing him against the wall. He screamed for her to get back to the door, but she ignored him, firing at the Queen as she charged towards Billy. With each shot, handfuls of leeches flew from the massive body, but every one lost. A half dozen more were clambering on. On the fourth shot, the Queen turned toward her, hesitating, as if unable to decide who to go after. "Get in," she shouted. "I'm on my way." Billy ran for the door, hoping to God she had a plan. She continued to fire at the creature, pump and shoot, and then there was nothing but a dry click that Billy could hear across the room, the sound of inevitable defeat. The Leech Queen heard it too, and started for her, her body continuing to grow, to pick up mass as she lurched wetly forward. Billy had reached the south door and stood there, adrenaline pouring through his body, fumbling through his pack for the last 2 magnum rounds. "Run!" he shouted, but Rebecca ignored him, not moving at all. She wasn't reloading, wasn't even reaching for the handgun as the Queen approached. Instead, she hefted the shotgun by its barrel, stepped back so that she was touching the incinerator wall, and drove the heavy stock through the sheet metal of the heat duct, popping one of the panels out with an aluminum crunch. Burning matter spilled out across the floor. Rebecca jumped into the midst of it, kicking wildly, driving lumps of flaming synthetics and rubbish into the nearest wave of leeches. The Queen shrieked, ceased its advance, still well away from the sudden fire. Scorched leeches scurried to their father Queen, tried to climb the towering body, to find solace there, but brought pain with them as they flocked together, attaching to the mobile hive. The Queen's shriek grew in intensity as the smoking, burning leeches joined her, damaging her, making her writhe in what Billy hoped was insufferable agony. Rebecca saw her chance and took it, running for the south wall as the Queen tore at herself, screaming. Billy emptied the revolver on the floor, dropped the last 2 rounds into the chamber, and snapped it close, holding it on the Queen as Rebecca ran past her. But the Queen was beyond caring, at least for the moment, parts of her insane body turning black, melting, running like molasses to the pool on the smoldering floor. Billy kept the magnum trained on the contorting Queen until Rebecca was past him, and through the door. He quickly backed in after her, and she slammed the door closed. He took a deep breath, felt the pain in his ribs, in his arms and his legs, his head, a dull agony in every pore of his body, until he turned around and saw what Rebecca was pointing at, a smile of surprised delight on her shocked, smudged face. His pain dropped away, became nothing but a nagging background to his own sudden relief. They'd shut themselves into a platform elevator shaft, one that went up, and from the depth of the wide tunnel that stretched away from them at a diagonal, leading toward a circle of light far above. The platform appeared to go all the way to the surface. They grinned at each other like children, too dumb with happiness to speak, but only for a few seconds. Their smiles broke as the dying Queen roared, her horrible voice carrying from the next room, reminding them how close they still were to dying themselves. Without saying a word, they ran to the platform, ran to the standing console that controlled the elevator. Billy studied the switches for a beat, then, with a silent prayer for deliverance, snapped the power on. The platform started to climb. carrying them up and away from the nightmare, or so they believed. Chapter 16. The agony was magnificent in its measure, killing her with an intensity beyond any she'd ever known. The burning children clung to her, starved for release. As they touched her, touched their siblings, they passed their pain on in a wave that would not cease. It went on and on until parts of the collective gathered and fell away, dying, melting, her children sacrificing themselves so that she might live. Slowly, slowly, the agony receded, trained away from the physical, became the suffering of loss, of infinite sorrow. As the injured pulled away, left her enveloping arms to die alone, the rest of the children came forward singing, crooning to her, easing her torment as best they could. They engulfed her, soothed her with their liquid kisses, and by their sheer numbers they overtook her. It was only took a moment. The queen lost her identity as Marcus had lost his, giving over to the hive, becoming more, becoming all. The allness of the new creature was whole and healthy, a giant, different than before, stronger. It heard mechanical sounds nearby. It reached inside itself, accessed the mind for information, understood the murderers were trying to flee. They would not escape. The hive gathered itself on 1,000 supple limbs and went after them. Scene change. Neither of them wanted to think about running into any further trouble, but they had to assume the worst. Rebecca checked the handguns, while Billy loaded the shotgun, the two of them calling out the dismal numbers. 15 9mm rounds left all total, 4 shotgun shells, 2 magnum rounds. We probably won't need them anyway, Rebecca said hopefully, staring up at the growing circle of light. The elevator was slow but steady. They were already halfway to the surface. Would be there in just another minute or two. Billy nodded, holding his left side with one dirty hand. Think that bitch cracked one of my ribs, he said, but smiled a little, also looking up at the light. Rebecca stepped toward him, concerned, reaching out to touch his side. But before she could, an alarm started to blare down the shaft. Each door they slipped past now had a red light flashing over it, casting crimson splotches of color over the rising platform. What? Billy started, but was interrupted by the calm, feminine voice of a recorded loop. The self-destruct system has been activated. All personnel must evacuate immediately. Repeat. The self-destruct system. Activated by who? Rebecca asked. Billy shushed her, holding up one hand, listening. Immediately. Sequence will commence in 10 minutes. The lights kept flashing, the siren blatting, but the voice stopped. Billy and Rebecca exchanged a worried look, but there wasn't much they could do, and they'd be long gone in 10 minutes, God willing. Maybe the Queen, Rebecca said, not finishing the thought. It seemed unlikely, but she couldn't think of how else the system might have been triggered. Could be, Billy said. Thought he looked doubtful. Anyway, we'll be out of here before it happens. She nodded, and they heard the crash below, the thundering, squealing rip of metal, of incredible ruin at the base of the elevator shaft. They both looked down, found spaces in the platform's partial grid floor, saw what was coming. It was the Queen. Only not the Queen. This was much, much bigger, and a hell of a lot faster. A giant dark mass pulling itself after them. Rebecca looked up, saw how close they were. Just one more minute and we'll be out. She looked down again, her breath catching as she saw how close it was already. She had the image of a crashing wave, black and alive, opening up as it sped toward them, revealing more blackness inside. Oh shit, Billy said, and the platform upended, broke through a wall, pitching both of them off. Rebecca landed on her side, hard, immediately got to her feet. Still holding on to the shotgun, Billy was getting off the floor a few meters away, concrete, painted, yellow lines radiating out from beneath his feet. Helipad. Underground helipad. They were in a vast room. No helicopters in sight, but plenty of random mechanical equipment strewn about. The small islands of metal only emphasizing the room's spaciousness. What little light there was came from a few stray shafts of sunlight coming down from the modal ceiling, which meant they were only a single floor from the surface. It took Rebecca the space of a heartbeat to see where they were, a second beat to locate the Queen, what the Queen had become. It was crawling out of the ragged hole in the wall where the elevator platform had come through, flopping masses of tentacles over the broken pieces of metal and stone. It was like some crazy optical illusion, watching as it pulled itself from the shaft, its colossal form just coming and coming. The thing that finally expelled itself onto the concrete floor was as big as a moving van, long and low, and seething with twisted vines of leech matter. Rebecca could only stare, and was nearly jerked off her feet when Billy grabbed her arm, pulling her away. "There's a staircase over there," he motioned vaguely at an exit sign across the room, what seemed an incredible distance away. And as if it could hear them, could understand, the Queen monster moved, heaved its great bulk across the floor with surprising speed, heading off their escape route. It half turned back toward them, tentacles whipping about its shapeless head, a thick puddle of blackish goo spilling out from beneath its hideous frame, and started to rear up, and then squealed, pitching back and forth, a high, hissing noise erupting from its squalid body. Smoke actually started to rise from its back, from where sunlight, a shaft of sunlight, thin but bright, lay across the beast's back. The creature sidled to one side, moving out of the light, and started for them again. Billy grabbed her again, pulled her back. The self-destruct alarm continued to bleat, echoing through the helipad, and the female voice calmly informed them that they now had 8 minutes before the sequence would commence. "It can't handle the sunlight," she shouted. As she and Billy both turned, started to run, they headed for the room's northwest corner, the farthest from the monster as it humped toward them, twining between the stray beams of light. It wasn't as fast as it had been in the elevator shaft, less to push against it, but it could almost keep up with them running. "Any idea how we open the roof?" Billy asked, shooting a look behind them, steering them more north. "Power's out," she panted, "but there should be manual latches, probably hydraulic. If the roof's on an incline, it'll slide open when we unlock them. We can hope." "Do it," Billy said, visibly winded. "I'll try and keep her distracted." Rebecca nodded, looking back at the creature. It had fallen behind, but it wasn't flagging, wasn't struggling to catch its breath the way they were. She headed for a likely-looking panel on the nearest wall, as behind her, Billy turned and started to fire the 9mm. Scene change. The hive went after them, shedding matter from its back where the light had touched. Its consciousness wasn't entirely animal nor human, but possessed elements of both. It understood that its home was threatened, that another force would destroy its shelter soon. It understood that sunlight meant pain, even death, and it understood that the two humans that ran before it were the cause of it all, were the instrument of its imminent destruction. One of the humans stopped, aimed a weapon, fired. Projectiles pierced its outer flesh, wounding, but it did not penetrate to the core. As with the sunburns, the creature shed the injured matter and continued on, gaining quickly now, close enough to smell the human's terror. It lunged forward, knocking him down. Scene change. Shit. Billy hit the ground as the queen monster jumped at him, one of the waving tentacles lashing at his feet out from under him. He tried to roll away, but it had his right ankle in a firm grip. Cursing, Billy pushed himself closer to the mass of the creature, brought his own other heel down on the bunched tentacle as hard as he could, and again, the appendage retracted, the monster thrashing away from him. Billy sprang to his feet, spotted Rebecca at the west wall and messing with the control panel. He turned east and ran, looking back to make sure the thing was on his trail. Sequence will commence in 7 minutes. Lovely. It never rained, but it goddamn poured. Billy ran faster, pushing himself, the monster trailing too close for comfort. When he'd gotten far enough to risk it, he turned, saw Rebecca at another control panel across the room. The monster lunged for him, but was too far away to reach, its outstretched limbs still a meter away. Billy got off a shot into what seemed to be its face, then turned and ran again, stumbling on rubbery legs. The thing came after him, seemingly inexhaustible. "Come on, Rebecca," he pleaded silently, forcing himself to go faster. Scene change. Rebecca reached the fourth and final latch as the recorded loop told them that they had 6 minutes left. She grabbed the small wheel that served as the manual key, twisted, and it was stuck. Not entirely, but it took all her strength to manage just a half a turn. She strained, felt her muscles scream for leniency as she got another half a turn. Almost there. Rebecca, move! She shot a look back, saw that somehow the queen monster had gotten close, too close. It would be on her in 30 seconds, but she wouldn't run. Knew that she couldn't afford the time it would take to circle around to try again. Billy was firing, the sound of bullets hitting liquid flesh terrifyingly immediate. She didn't even look. Knew she'd lose her nerve if she saw how close it actually was. Come on, she screamed, pulling at the obstinate wheel with all she had, and it came unstuck, even as a thick, wet limb wrapped around her left ankle, horribly alive with slick, diseased movement, and with a heavy squeak of powdering rust, the heavens split wide, raining light all over them. Scene change. The light! The light! The hive screamed as death rained down, the first poaching its skin, then boiling it, thousands of individual leeches dying, falling away, the burning worse than fire because it was everywhere, all at once. It tried to escape, to find shelter from the torture, but there was nothing, there was nowhere. The two humans ran, disappeared through a hole in the wall, but the creature didn't notice, didn't care. It twisted and turned, giant sheaves of flesh scaping away, layers of its body smearing across the concrete, exposing the pulsing, pink center of itself to the cruel, killing light, the disinfectant light of day. By the time the building exploded a few minutes later, there was hardly anything left of it, only a handful of straggling leeches, confused, drowning in the lake of death that had once been their father, had once been James Marcus. Chapter 17. They half ran, half staggered away, weaving between tree trunks in cool morning air. The experience, for Billy, crazy, surreal, from shooting at giant leech monsters in the dark to a run in the woods, birds singing their morning songs overhead, a light breeze ruffling their dirty, matted hair. They kept moving, Billy silently counting down, until he got somewhere near 0. He stopped, looked around, as Rebecca also halted, breathing heavily. They'd come out of the woods to a small clearing, high on a hill that overlooked the eastern Arklay forest. Here looks good, Billy said. He took a deep, cleansing breath and dropped, sprawling on the ground, his muscles cheering. Rebecca did the same, and a few seconds afterward, the countdown was over. The explosion was massive, shaking the ground, the roar of it washing across the forest over the valley beneath them. After a moment, Billy sat up, watched the smoke billowing up over the treetops. As tired as he was, as sore and hungry and emotionally drained, he felt at peace, somehow, watching the smoke of that terrible place drift off into the new day. Rebecca sat with him, also silent, her expression almost dreamy. There was nothing that needed to be said. They'd both been there. He absently scratched at his wrist, at a tickle there, and the handcuffs fell off, landing in the grass with a muffled clink. Billy smiled. At some unknown point, the second cuff must have come loose. Shaking his head, thinking of how nice it would have been to have lost them about 12 hours before. He tossed them toward a stand of trees. Rebecca stood, turned away from the smoke, shading her eyes. That must be the place Enrico was talking about, she said. Billy forced himself to stand, moved to her side. There, maybe a mile or two away, and well beneath their vantage point, was a huge mansion shrouded with trees. Its windows glared against the morning light, giving it a closed and empty look. Billy nodded, suddenly not sure what to say. She'd be wanting to get with her team, and as for him... Rebecca reached over and grasped his dog tags, tugging them firmly. The chain gave, popped free, and she fastened the tags around her own slender throat, looking out at the mansion. Guess it's time to say goodbye, she said. Billy watched her, but she didn't look at him, only stared at her next destination, that silent house, half hidden by trees. Officially, Lieutenant William Cohen is dead, she said. Billy tried to laugh, but it didn't take. Yeah, I'm a zombie now, he said, a little surprised at the sudden wistful feeling in his chest, in his gut. She turned, met his gaze, held it with her own. He saw honesty there, and compassion, and strength, and he saw that she too felt the same strange longing, the same vague sorrow that had dropped over him like a soft shadow. If things had been different, if circumstances weren't what they were. She nodded, ever so slightly, as if reading his mind, agreeing with what she read there. Then she straightened, her head high, her shoulders back, and snapped a salute, still looking into his eyes. Billy mirrored her posture, returning the salute, holding it until she dropped her hand. Without another word, she turned and walked away, heading for a gently sloping decline among the trees. He watched her until she disappeared, lost to the shadows of the woods. She turned, looking for a path of his own. He decided that south sounded pretty good, and started walking, enjoying the warm sun on his shoulders, the song of the birds in the trees. Epilogue. The distant explosion reached the Spencer estate, shook it so very slightly. Dust shifted on the tables, dirt trickled in the underground tunnels, and the creatures that still lived there turned blind. Dead eyes to the windows, to the walls, listening, groping in the darkness, hoping that the very slight movement meant that food would be coming soon. They were hungry. And that is going to be it, guys. Thank you all so very much for hanging out and listening to me reading the finale for Resident Evil 0 Hour. Woohoo! We'll be starting the Umbrella Conspiracy, Resident Evil Chapter 1, Resident Evil 1, but based on the game or whatnot. Pretty soon, hopefully, we'll be able to keep these going every day for the whole week, the whole month. And we might not finish these books by the end of October, but I will probably end up just continuing the series. I know I'm not getting like a huge following for these books, and that's totally okay, because these are for you special elite subscribers, and maybe in the future these videos may pick up more. You never know. But that's going to be it. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Don't forget to bring a towel. Peace out. It's been a lot of fun.